that I'm, as I said before, I'm an Episcopalian, a progressive Episcopalian, and if you call that a Christian, I'm a Christian. So I'm very sympathetic with your motives, so to speak. I do think that, as you said at the beginning, to split a religious life and economic life is a mistake. Someday, in a couple of years, I'm going to do a book called God in Mammon, Economic Sermons. Mammon is the Aramaic for money, so God and money. And there'll be short Episcopal sermons. But I'll be making kind of the opposite argument that you're making, and I'd like to know your reaction. The book, God and Mammon, will be arguing that you can have, in a way it's not opposed to you, but some ways it is. It'll be arguing that you can be a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew or a Hindu or whatever, and still be a full participant in economic life. As I think you would agree, and maybe we're in more agreement here than I think. Jesus frequently draws on profane examples, economic examples, of course always to point up. But still, it's not as if he's urging us, and here we should think, he's not urging us to be holy fools. He's not saying, he only said that once, give away all your goods and follow me. That's not his theme. So maybe our purposes are similar. I don't think I agree with a lot of your economic arguments. For example, I don't think that trickle up or trickle down is what economics is about. That's a Keynesian argument that you'll hear the trickle up from the Democratic side, and then people allege that trickle down is from the Republican side. But anyway, on this matter of God and Mammon, are we in agreement or not?
Well, we are in agreement that religion is not merely about a spiritual realm. It's not merely about spirituality. Yeah. It is about the whole thing. And if you look at Jesus, he had all these material interests. So Jesus was not a fool saying, well, I'll leave economics to somebody else. Yeah. Actually, there's a story where, they tried to trick him, talking about paying taxes.
Of course.
They come and they show him, that they ask him, should we pay taxes to the emperor? And everybody knows the story, right? So Jesus then says, well, show me the coin, and they show him the coin, and you have the emperor's image on the coin, and then Jesus' response is, well, then give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God. Now, except that for an ancient Jew at that time, the answer was pretty obvious. What belongs to God? Well, for a modern religious thinker, we sometimes think, well, what belongs to God is religion. Yeah. For a Jew at the time of Jesus, it was pretty clear what belongs to God, everything.
Your whole
God
life.
Created heaven and earth. God created material things. So in that sense, it's not a matter of either or. And that's the surprise here. Everything belongs to God. That's where the challenge comes in. Now, the other problem then becomes, once you've said that Jesus and religion, Abrahamic religions, all care about material reality, I try to argue there are different ways of conceiving of material reality. So it could be built from a worker's perspective, it could be built from a business perspective, it could be built from a community's perspective, from other perspectives. And that's a conversation I think that we haven't quite had yet, because we're assuming that economics is one perspective. I'm saying there are other valid perspectives here that we ought to be at least bringing into the discussion, because not everybody would agree as to what this whole material thing is all about.
Yeah.
Plus, when you say that Jesus is actually focusing on a profane reality, I think that's true.
He often does, not always.
But it always focuses on that reality from a particular perspective.
Pointing up.
But also God being in the midst of it. So up in that
Up
comes
in that
down in the actual struggles.
Absolutely.
So that's where you have the whole thing together. And the interesting discussion for all of us would be, what does that mean for how we measure economics, how we talk about the flow of power, how we talk about the flow of money, and so on.
On the other hand, where I think we more sharply do not agree is what you just said, that there's the labor perspective, the business perspective, and that they're distinct. It's a core argument in economics. Now, it could be false. Let's see. That the pursuit of profit is good for the poor. The pursuit of profit is good for the poor, which is to say that the economy is a positive-sum game. It's not a zero-sum game. So your assertion, which I think is false, I'll be sharp here, the assertion that you made that we have weekends because of the labor movement is, I believe, incorrect. Now, I was a member of the faculty union at my university, and when I was a kid, I was a member of the National Maritime Union, so I'm not against unions for some purposes. But unions are not why we're rich. Unions are not why we have 40-hour weeks. Unions are not why in some countries we have high wages and in others low. But let me, as Cromwell said to the Presbyterians, consider in the bowels of Christ that you may be mistaken about the idea that there is a divergence of interest between the workers and the bosses.
In fact, I would agree. I think you're misunderstanding what I'm saying. I would agree that the economy is not a zero-sum game.
Good.
But precisely for that reason, I would say that gains for working people, and you know, unions have actually produced gains for working people that are not disputable. You cannot say, it's not possible to say that unions have not accomplished anything. There's a history there that has to be taken seriously. Well, we disagree on that one, but the point here being, if it's not a zero-sum game, it may well be that if working people are doing better, everybody is doing better, and that's something we should consider.
That's the trickle-up theory.
No, that's the argument that the economy is not a zero-sum game. You accused me of arguing that. I'm actually saying it isn't. And whether it's trickle up or trickle down, what I'm saying is, if all of us are doing better, that's great for the world.
I agree.
In that sense, the other conversation we have to have then is about inequality as it currently stands and who benefits from that, because there's a very particular situation that has to be addressed.
I'll say one more thing and then I promise you I'll shut up. Okay. About equality, you've just made a claim, which is very widely believed. It's on the TV, it's in the newspapers. Inequality is a big problem. Inequality has increased. I assert that it hasn't. that inequality of essential goods has gone down since, say, my childhood in the 1950s, when a much higher percentage of the labor force was in unions. In a few countries, I got a 50-page review of Piketty's book that you can read if you want. In a few countries, inequality of wealth has gone up. But wealth isn't the same thing as essential consumption. We have better health care, more people going to higher education, improved food, improved housing, air conditioning, even for lots of poor people. And in those respects, those ones that you and I agree are the fundament, those are more equal than they've ever been internationally and inside most countries. When inequality has increased in wealth, it's been largely because of housing policy and housing disasters. So that's my claim.
Let me briefly respond. I think that's another argument that we could have, that there are actually places where inequality may have gone down. What concerns me, though, is the numbers I quoted, that you have upwards of 33% of children living in poverty. And that's not so much a matter simply of material goods. That's a matter of
education.
That's a matter of health. That's a matter of possibilities where you can move in life. And so it's that conversation that I think we still need to be having. Yeah. Also, I would argue here's a political component. In a short presentation, one cannot say everything. Economics and politics are linked at that point if you look at how power is distributed. I'm very proud that in America we have strong democratic traditions, but I'm worried that a growing sort of inequality that may be different than what you're describing is actually hurting our democracy in such a way that we do not have one person, one vote anymore, but we may have now $1, one vote, and that concerns me.
Yeah.
You want me to go?
I have a question.
Sure.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, please.
I have a question that changes the subject somewhat. It may not draw a great applause. We'll see. I know Bob Nelson, who you quoted in your talk. Bob was a graduate student at Princeton in economics and had a remarkable job for many years at the Department of Interior, dealing with environmental issues. Now I think still teaches at the University of Maryland. But I asked him once why he worked on other things and then became interested in studying religion and the connection with economics. And I asked him why he did that. And what he said was that when he worked on environmental issues, he came to realize that most of the proposals that economists make that would be sensible, rational, cost-effective, in other words, for example, instead of saying that you have 3,000 regulations about what kind of fuel you use to affect pollution, instead, you might have a tax on pollution directly. It's kind of most economists would think that's a sensible thing to do. Sure. That whenever he encountered environmental groups, they completely and hostily opposed this and would not listen to any discussions about efficiency at all. He came to believe that the only way he could ever understand them was through understanding how people get their beliefs, and he thought religion was the way to go. So I'm curious if you think that's true. Do you have insights about how people, because it is true that most religious people say, in the end, you must believe in God. That the belief is nothing that you test. There's no evidence. So, and I've always wondered whether maybe understanding why people are prepared to say that would tell you something about what other things they might be prepared to do. What do you think of that? Does
Yes.
religion tell us about that?
Thank you for that question. I would argue that, of course, there is one way of looking at religion in precisely this way, to say this is held, beliefs held that are not tested. But the one example I gave, and there are other examples, in these ancient traditions, there's oftentimes testing, there's oftentimes doubt. In the Psalms, for instance, you have this question, how long do we have to wait, O God? So in that sense, there's a hope that God will eventually come through, and that beliefs will be verified, that they can be tested. What I talked about, of course, compare what I said about economics as religion to your work. You're dealing with data. You're not dealing with these big ideas and principles. So there's different ways of going about this. There is, however, as Nelson points out, people whose main job is to keep the big ideas alive. We could talk about specific individuals who are doing just that. Now, that also happens in other fields, like environmentalism, like you mentioned. I would not argue that this sort of environmentalism is necessarily the most helpful way of approaching it. So in that sense, I would say, if you go with another tradition that looks at belief not just as something that you have to assume and then you have to sit still, but as belief as something that can be tested, even though it may take a while for that test to run through, it may take a while for God to come through. If you go with that tradition, I think you have some options to think about religion differently. And that's what I was proposing. You can think about religion as practices. You can think about religion as habits. You can think about religion even as organizing. So when Christians talk about discipleship, for instance, we think that may have to do with Wednesday night chicken fellowship dinners and singing in the choir. But what Jesus was doing with his disciples, discipling them, discipleship really meant organizing, teaching them, and also bringing them together in such a way that they would be leading a different life. And that too is something that I think we have to take seriously in the debate. What I would argue, though, is that is a distinct approach to religion that we're not always paying much attention to.
Belief is not propositional. And that's crucial. Atheists who make the new atheists think that religion is about believing 6 impossible things before breakfast. It's not about proposition. It's, as you say, it's about practice. It's about a way of life. 613 commandments in Orthodox Judaism. They're not propositions. They're not E equals MC squared. So I'm sorry.
Chris, did you want to go?
So just sometimes with discussion about what is economics and how much of this discussion is driven by, in the United States, we have economic entrepreneurs largely out of think tanks and based in Washington, D.C., or think tanks around the country that have a political orientation that have kind of dominated what we think about as economics. But while you were talking, I kept thinking, well, I know it's a heterodox profession. There's lots of disagreement about the things that you're saying. But at the same time, in our public discourse, what you were saying is not that controversial. Although I think if you talk to economic historians and you talk to different groups of economists, there's a lot of stuff where they would actually, what's your problem? I don't have an issue with what you're saying or much of what you're saying.
I think that's right, and so my task is simply reclaiming something that you're rightly saying is already in the popular discourse. And also then to say maybe there's different places where we have to gather our economic wisdom. So if you're gathering economic wisdom, it's still a good idea to listen and to pay attention to top economists. But if you want to know what's really happening in the economy, it may also be good to have a long conversation with a homeless person. It may be good to have a long conversation with a Walmart worker. This is where I keep learning a few things, because not only is it that there are people who are making low wages and whatever, they can tell us much more about how they got there, how their communities relate to them, how religion functions in that context, how politics functions in that context. And so in that sense, all I'm doing is really not reinventing the wheel, but bringing these things back into the conversation. Now, for me, primarily, my discourse is religious studies, theology, so I'm not so much trying to change the field of economics, but to bring some of these conversations back home to say, let's talk about stuff that actually matters and where difference is already being made and where things shape up in a different way that we're not expecting. Some of that, I think, has to do with the large amounts of money that is flowing into these think tanks and into the media. That's the other problem with inequality, that some people actually have much more of a podium than others to make their arguments. Yeah.
See, I think economics does need to change. I think conventional, traditional economics is a very crude characterization of what a person is. Really, I mean, we have to be honest about it, right? There's what is a person? It's infinite wants, which are exogenous. We don't explain where they come from. They're just infinite wants, and there's stuff that we want. And it's the relationship between this individual with infinite wants and stuff. And that is hopelessly inadequate, not just with religion, but modern psychology, neuroscience, the lot. Human beings are not like that. And economics is a deeply conservative subject, so we're desperately clinging on to this rational, selfish individual and stuff. We need a revolution. The one subject we really respect is physics. So let me use an analogy. Economics wishes desperately that the world were like physics, but the world of physics that we worship is 19th century classical mechanics. There are billiard balls and force, and the force is greed, and the billiard balls are people, and so it's all very predictable. That's our world, I'm afraid, you know, the rational billiard ball. And then 100 years ago, physics went through a massive intellectual revolution. It abandoned classical mechanics because it was wrong, and it replaced it with quantum mechanics. Mm-hmm. And the building blocks of quantum mechanics were utterly different. They looked weird to classical physicists. And there are really two building blocks. One was that it wasn't stuff that mattered, it was interactions. Mm-hmm. And I think economics needs that move. It's not individual people, it's interactions between people. Mm. People are social animals first. We are born into social networks. We get our identities from social networks, our preferences, our values from the society we're in, before we get rationality. Right? And so that's one thing. So let me finish up. The other component of quantum mechanics, as well as interactions of fundamental, not stuff, is that things come in packages, quanta, and mental constructs come in packages. People's beliefs, people's values, where they come from participation in a social network, so all the people in a social network are exposed to the same narratives, the same values, the same norms, so they're packaged there, and the values and norms and narratives that people hold are packaged in an individual head because we try and avoid cognitive dissonance. We try and hold beliefs which kind of hang together. Mm-hmm. And so I feel we need to reformulate economics with a richer sense of behaviors where we learn not from direct observation of the world, we learn from the narratives that we hear. We're motivated not just by greed for stuff, but by the concern for the norms of other people. We want peer esteem, and we want self-esteem, and we get that by enacting an identity that we've absorbed from a social network. And our desire for stuff individually is traded off with our desire for self-esteem and peer esteem. And that would give us a much richer view of society. It would be more complicated, a richer view of behavior. And it would, I think, chime much more with both a religious view of what people are like and what ordinary people know that people are like. We've shriveled the view of mankind.
I call it, this morning when you weren't here, I introduced the word humanomics. That's what you're talking about.
It seems to me, in terms of what you just said, this relationship is really the fundamental question. And if we thought about economic inequality in that sense, then it weren't simply a matter of how much things do people have, but what kinds of relationships are we living? Yeah. How does power shape up in these relationships? So in that sense, question of power, of course, is also a question of physics, and it's not the billiard balls. So in that sense, relationship, power. What I also suggested was this whole question of measuring the health of the economy in terms of the contributions that people make to it. So it's not just what do I get out of it, but how do I plug into it? So how do I function as a worker? Am I simply a little cog in a wheel, or do I have a place where I can actually contribute something that's good for relationships, that's good for community? That's the environmental question ultimately. How does that help the globe? How does that help the planet? So in that sense, I think that's where we are agreed. That was my question about the numbers, the very interesting numbers we saw in the earlier lecture about global wage differentials. How does the McDonald's example now fit into the broader economy? And once we have that conversation, the difficult part of the conversation then is to say, maybe in this relationship, some people are more equal than others, and some people are sort of distorting these relationships or preventing us from living these relationships more fully. And that's always the tough part, because now it seems like we're pointing fingers. But it's a question we too have to raise, if we're serious about relationships.
I also wanted to pick up on your point that work can give positive value to people. In economics, work's the negative in order to get the stuff. But that's, again, a terribly shriveled view. I've just finished a book on the refugee crisis. I've been working with Syrian refugees in Jordan the last couple of years. And the model we have for dealing with refugees, UNHCR, is a very shriveled humanitarian view of what is a person. Food, shelter. Mm-hmm. That's it. The efficient way to provide that is a camp, right? That's what they do. A very large majority of Syrian refugees have completely bypassed the camps. They've chosen not to go there. They've chosen to ignore the food and the shelter, even though it's free. Why? Because most of all, first and foremost, they want the autonomy and the dignity that comes from being able to work.
Yep.
And so what do they have to do? They have to head into the towns where they're not allowed to work, but they can, below the radar screen, get some sort of job. And about 85% of them choose that rather than this shriveled existence in the camps. So yes, work is fundamental. By that, people participate and so get human dignity.
Mm-hmm. In terms of the ancient traditions here, too, it's not always clear that we're talking about the same thing where we're talking about justice, for instance. In the old Roman traditions, you have justice as an idea of neutrality, Lady Justice with a blindfold, holding a sword in the one hand and the scales in the other. In the Jewish Christian traditions, Muslim too, you have justice as being faithful, being truthful to the community. So it's a matter of building relationships. And as you build and restore relationships, sometimes you have to take sides. Sometimes you have to actually side with those who are pushed under the wheel. Or you also have to say a few harsh words to those who are denying relationships, who are destroying relationships. And maybe that's something you can also learn from the refugees. Where are they going? How are they rebuilding relationships? Who benefits and who loses?
I can't tell you how it kills me to cut off a discussion. It breaks my teacher's heart. But I want us to leave on time. A reminder that this evening in this room there is a panel economic balance, achieving economic balance closer to the ground with a panel of Minnesota experts. Simultaneous to that is a concert. And also, just a reminder to Gustavus students, you have exclusive access to these folks this evening. Please take advantage of this incredible opportunity.
Thank you all for coming.
Well, I met